All right. Hello. We're live on Twitch. Um, Today we are joined by Brian Sharp, who's going to be talking on how to give a talk. Brian is a former member of the games industry, but for many years gave talks on management and leadership at GDC for Amplify Voices. And this talk originated at their boot camp, so we're lucky to have him speaking about it again with us today. And we'll also be doing a live Q&A after the talk, so in about 30 minutes. And post any questions in the Twitch chat that you have, and we'll answer them at the end of the talk. And now I will pass it off to you, Brian.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction. And for everyone watching, I am not watching the Twitch stream right now, but I will as soon as I'm done with the talk. So if you put questions in there, I'll try to scroll back and find them, or I'll just ask you to repeat them. I'm Brian Sharp. This is a talk about how to practice and improve at public speaking. A little background about Amplify New Voices, which is what I wrote the talk for and what I've been giving it at for a few years now. Amplify New Voices is a one-day boot camp that we do before the Game Developers Conference every year for emerging leaders from underrepresented demographics. So the idea is, if you are at a point in your career in the video games industry where you're about to start needing to do press interviews, talks, be the public face of your project or your team or something like that, there's a lot of skills that you talk, that aren't necessarily the same skills that you've needed to do your job beforehand. And often having a background in those skills is kind of a question of privilege. Like, did you go to a high school that had a speech and debate club, or did you go to happen to go to a college that taught you about, kind of public face presentation and that kind of stuff? So Amplifying New Voices, every year we run through three things. We run through public speaking, how to write a good bio, and we'd give you a little press training. And so this is the talk I've been giving to open the public speaking portion. This is the first time I've given it to a group other than Amplifying New Voices, so I'm pretty excited to be able to give it to y'all, and I hope that you find it useful. So the first time I was asked to give this talk was in 2017. It was 4 years ago. And as it happened, 2 days before the Game Developers Conference, I was flying back from Europe to California. I had a layover in Ireland where I rented a car and had a challenging time. So I always rent cars on layovers, just because if you only have anywhere between 8 hours and 2 days to see someplace, renting a car is the fast. You don't have to figure out the transit system. You're not waiting on Ubers. Some of my best travel memories have been from short layovers where I got a car and got to see a bunch of really good stuff in rapid succession. I did know going into this that in Ireland, they drive on the opposite side of the road from any country I'd ever driven in before. I had kind of psyched myself up for it and convinced myself that I could do it. And I got to the rental car counter in the Dublin airport, and they had these like huge those like tall banners that are usually like outside car dealerships. They were all like, "It's not that bad. Don't be too scared." And I was like, well, I wasn't scared before I saw this, but maybe I should be. So then I walked out into the parking garage, and maybe some of you watching know the punchline here. I had no idea that the driver's side of the car is on the opposite side. So you're sitting on the right side of the car. The car was a manual, it's a stick shift, so you're like shifting with your left hand. I basically walked out to the parking garage, took one look at the car, and almost just turned around. I was like, I'll just sleep at the airport for 2 days. Like, so a friend of mine over text talked me off the ledge. He was like, I've done this. It's not that bad. You can do it. Get in the car and just kind of practice going through the motions. And so I did. I sat down. He assured me the pedals are not switched, because I was going to give up if that were the case. And so I practiced, reaching for the stick with my left hand and like adjusting my side view mirrors and thinking about how to stay centered in the lane, all that kind of stuff. Probably sat in that car in the parking garage for like a solid hour. And finally I was like, all right, well, it's now or never. And I put my destination in. I was trying to go to Newgrange, this World Heritage site up north of Dublin. I took a deep breath, pulled out of the airport parking garage, straight into a 3-lane traffic circle, a roundabout. So you're driving around this traffic circle. First of all, you're driving around clockwise, the opposite of what you do in the United States. It's 3 lanes wide, and there's a ton of cars. So you have to like be super careful about staying in your lane. Everyone's going really fast. Furthermore, I really think I'm not exaggerating when I say this. Every exit from the traffic circle had like the signs for the roads that it was going to. There were like 10, so like every single exit, it was like 10 different signs. And passing by so fast, trying not to kill anyone, looking at these things, like trying to spot the run, like I barely remember the road. I managed to keep myself together just long enough to like get steady enough that I felt like I could glance at my phone for like half a second. I had it open with the maps and everything. I looked down, and the GPS, instead of being a blue dot where I was a gray dot back in the parking garage. I still don't know what happened. My phone GPS just gave up, had no idea where I was, wouldn't give me any directions. At this point, I'm like bordering on full-blown panic. At some point, I just decided I'm just taking an exit. I'm taking any exit from this roundabout. This thing is like a nightmare. So take an exit. 100 feet down that exit drops me into another traffic circle. I was like, this is hell. Like, I am in hell. I don't know what I did. This is terrible. I'm happy to report that I did not die. I did not hit anyone. I was very convinced I was going to cause a traffic accident. Didn't cause any 10-car pileups. And the silver lining to this was that when I did make it back home 2 days later, I threw out the talk that I had been writing and rewrote it because I realized my experience driving in Ireland was a great metaphor for the challenges of public speaking. Both of these things are performances. And by performance, I mean you're doing a skilled thing for a committed period of time. You're doing it live, right? I could not pull off the road just in the middle of the traffic circle and stop. Right now, I can't just like turn my camera off and like come back in 5 minutes. Y'all are like waiting for me to give this talk. They also both, being performances, involve preparation. So preparation for a talk, you're rehearsing, you're experimenting, you're trying out phrasings. For me, in Dublin, this was me sitting in the car before I started it, right in the parking garage going through. Preparation and performance are tied together in the sense that my performance on the road would have been better if I had thought to prepare more. You know, if I'd anticipated the GPS failing for whatever reason, I could have studied the maps a little more and been like, okay, it's the third turn. And that would have helped. So, and this is kind of the crux of this talk, is the reason that those things would have helped is because they would have reduced the amount of things that were taking up conscious space in my head while I was doing the performance, right? The things that I had to pay attention to, the things kind of that I would call like a cognitive conscious load. I think one way to make this really clear is think about, you know, when you're driving, if you're from the United States and you have a driver's license, when you're driving in America, probably most of the stuff is on autopilot, right? Even if I'm driving a stick shift, shifting with my right hand, I don't think about it. I don't have to pay attention to it. It doesn't distract me. Using the pedals, using the steering wheel, staying in the lane, all these things are so habituated that they don't need to occupy any of my conscious attention. So when something does go wrong, I have attention left to devote to it. Your conscious attention is a super limited resource, right? In Ireland, so much was demanding my conscious attention that when even the smallest thing went wrong, I was like, well, that's it. Like, I'm overwhelmed. This slide I actually just added this year. I'm a little surprised I didn't add it sooner because it seems a little obvious in hindsight. For people who find public speaking scary, you're correct, right? It is scary. I want to kind of reassure you of that. I mean, I've been doing public speaking for, I think, almost 30 years. I gave a talk at PAX Dev, another game development conference, and it was about anxiety and stress in the game development process. And so part of it was I did this little gimmick where I wore my heart rate monitor strap that I wear for biking, and I wore it to sleep that night. So I checked my heart rate when I woke up. I checked my heart rate right when I headed to the convention center. And then while I was giving the talk, and I was talking about this topic of, you know, giving presentations and how people feel like they're bad at it because they get nervous, I flipped over my little bike computer and I said, right now, you know, this morning my heart rate was 60. When I woke up, it was about 70 when I came to the convention center. And right now, standing on stage in front of all of you, it's 105. I think this is really key to understand because it's like a lot of people seem to think that being good at public speaking means that you're not nervous when you do it. I think that is not just a misunderstanding, it can be actively dangerous, because if you believe that, then you believe that the goal of getting better at public speaking is to like fight that fear, is to like engage with it. I was listening to a talk by Alan Watts, the Buddhist Westerner, recently, and he was talking about this. He said, a lot of people who begin meditating think that they're bad meditators if they have thoughts. And so they fight with their thoughts and they try to like stop their mind from thinking. And I liked his metaphor here. He said that it's like trying to smooth the ocean waves with a flat iron. He said, not only does it not work, but you're just splashing around and making more waves. So you don't get less scared of public speaking by directly engaging with the fear and wrestling with it. You get less scared by just doing it over and over and having it go well, even though you're scared. So what I'm talking about has nothing to do with how to engage with that fear. If you are afraid, just let yourself be afraid and then also do this stuff. And then over time, the fear will recede. I have a couple book recommendations in here. This is the first one. This is a really good book, Checklist Manifesto by a guy named Atul Gawande. It is about using checklists. It's as simple as it sounds. It's about using super simple checklists to reduce mistakes. And the whole theory of this book is like, people think it should be more complicated than this, and it's really not. He, the author, is a surgeon in Boston, and I think it fits in well with this because, of course, surgery is a performance with preparation. You can't stop in the middle, all that kind of stuff. So it fits into what we're talking about. I remember in particular a point in the book where he talks about the checklists that they have in airplanes for the pilots to use when things like engines have failed. He says the first item on the checklist is fly the plane, which says sounds absurd, but it turns out that when you have a situation like an engine failure or something that's really shocking, the pilots will get overwhelmed, and the first things they forget are all the basic stuff to do, like fly the plane, because their head's in this totally different space. Anyone who has had a really genuinely bad public speaking experience, I think, knows what this paralysis feels like, right? Where your mind goes fully blank and you are just standing there, and it's like you could hear a pin drop. I think you have to give yourself a lot of credit, because when you are speaking, it's not as simple as just doing one thing. You're doing a lot of things. You are communicating a message. You are saying words. You are trying to enunciate those words properly. You're trying to be careful about how fast you're talking. You're trying to make gestures. You're trying to potentially make eye contact, whether it's with a live audience or whether it's with thumbnails of people online. You're trying to keep your place in your notes while you're doing all this. There is a lot going on. So that means the best thing that you can do to help guarantee your talk goes well is to minimize the amount of conscious attention that each of these things take. You want to put as many of them as you can on autopilot. And so some of those things you do in preparation, some of those things you do in performance. So for the rest of the talk, I'm just going to go through a few examples of techniques that I use to put certain things that I find distracting on autopilot. Maybe they'll be useful to you. If they're not the things that distract you, you may have to come up with different techniques, but the general principle, I think, is sound. All right, so I'm going to start by talking about preparation, because it's the first thing you do. And for most talks, the most important thing you do in preparation is the obvious one, which is to think through the overall message and structure of the talk that you're giving. For most of us, that is something you obviously do want to do in preparation, because if you're trying to do it while you're performing, you are completely improvising a talk. And I do have some friends who can improvise a pretty good talk, but even for them, it's kind of like a parlor trick, right? It's like their talk is still better if they take the time to prepare it ahead of time. So I have two pieces of advice about message and structure. The single most important thing is keep it really simple. I used to think when I started giving kind of a 60-minute lecture format at a conference, I'm like, well, in 60-minute conversation with a friend, we can cover a ton of ground, so I can say a lot of things in this talk. Incorrect. In an hour-long talk, you can convey like one, like maybe two significant ideas, probably just one, that your audience has any hope of remembering if you do it well, right? It's not like you can if you do better, you can get more in. That's really about the limit. It's still kind of shocking to me, but I think the insight is like having a one-on-one conversation with a friend is very interactive. You're talking to one person. You can tailor what you're saying if they react in a certain way. Giving a talk to an audience, it's not interactive, so it's harder for the audience to remember a lot of the points because they're not as engaged. You can't tailor it to any specific person, and so on. So that really is, if you remember one thing from this talk, it's when you give a talk, really only try to convey about one point and just say it over and over and over for the entirety of the talk. And if you do it well, most of the audience might remember it. The second most important piece of advice I can give you here is to use memorable structures for your message. And that'll really help it stick too. The human brain remembers stuff in very weird ways. For example, we are terrible at remembering random lists of unrelated facts. Right? We're just really bad at that, but we're really good with other structures. So here's my second book recommendation, Peak by Anders Ericsson. I love this book, and I love Professor Ericsson's research. I actually just found out that he passed last year, which is really super saddening to me. I corresponded with him a bit when I was working on some art tools at Oculus, and I'd hope to work with him someday. In the meantime, definitely give this book a chance. It's really, really good. He is the authority on essentially how humans get good at things, how we master skills. And so he talks a lot in this book about how building experience in any field is tied to developing more nuanced mental representations for that field. So I think in terms of giving a talk, I think the two most powerful mental representations in terms of making ideas kind of sticky and memorable are the story and the metaphor. Story is simply a chain of events that are connected by causality, and a metaphor is just a rich way of equating two different things. You will notice that I began this talk with a story, and then I used this story as a metaphor, right? So those are two of my favorite structures. They don't have to be yours, but whichever structures you do choose, what I'm saying is be really deliberate about it, right? That's something that is really worth thinking about when you're writing the talk, and not just the information you want to convey, but how you're going to structure it. Think about what you want people to take away from the talk and then structure that information so that will really stick. Speaking flow. I was talking with some friends once about their rehearsal strategies for giving talks. And one of them said, he said, for me, rehearsal isn't about memorizing the talk. It's about finding the spots that I'm going to stumble over when I try to say them out loud so that I can figure out the little turns of phrase that I'll put in those spots to make it flow well when I say it. And then when I'm giving the talk, those pop into my head because I came up with them during rehearsal. So everyone does this a little differently, but if you don't solve this problem when you're giving a talk, you get to a point that's like maybe a slightly weird transition, or there's like an alliteration that's a little bit hard to say out loud or something like that, and you'll stumble over it. It happens to everyone, like it happens to all of us. This also tends to happen if you write your talk out just as prose. Like almost nobody I know speaks the same way that they would like write an email. And if they try to read their own email out loud, it sounds very canned and wooden. So if you don't have these turns of phrase kind of prepared ahead of time for the sticky parts, then when you get to one of them and it trips you up, that's kind of like my phone's GPS dying, right? When I was, in this traffic circle in Ireland, it's like an extra little hiccup, right? And that's the thing that we're trying to get rid of. So I'll tell you what I do. It is definitely not what most people do, I think. A lot of people really don't like this approach. But my point is simply that you find what works for you. I write all of my talks out longhand. Like I write out every single word. And to my point about the way that I talk being different from the way that I write, I don't just sit down and write it. I sit down, usually in a coffee shop, and I start like mumbling under my breath as though I were talking. I definitely look like a crazy person when I'm doing this. Mumbling under my breath, kind of the way that I would say it, and then I'll do like a paragraph like that, and I'll quickly transcribe it, including the little connectors, the likes, the ums, the rights, that kind of stuff, so that I know that I have text that if I literally just read it verbatim, it sounds natural. It sounds like the way I speak. And then in some cases, I'll spend the extra time to boil that down to bullet points so that I don't have the temptation to just read the notes directly. In some cases, I do. I just leave the speaker notes as the full text of the talk. I do not rehearse in front of an audience, right? That actually tends to make a talk feel a little more wooden to me, right? If I've been giving it in front of live audiences, especially very recently. So for example, I'm glad that this was a few weeks after Amplifying New Voices because now it's kind of fresh for me again. Like I said, this strategy is very different than what a lot of other people do. A lot of my friends say writing things out longhand is terrible for them, and that's what makes it feel wooden and stiff, and they have to rehearse in front of a live audience. The key is just to find your strategy, right? To get the word and phrasing choice on autopilot, so it's not something that you have to consciously think about while you are doing the performance. Time. Another thing you don't want to consciously worry about when you're talking is how much time you're taking. So you want to find some way to solve this in preparation, right? If you're not sure, especially if you're relatively new to public speaking, that kind of lingering anxiety of like, am I talking much faster? Am I talking too slow? Am I going to go way over my time? Am I going to finish really early? It can be really distracting. So what I do is I wait until I'm essentially done with the talk, so I'm not going to have to change it very much. Then I slice the talk up into slides, and then I read it aloud as though I were giving it. I just do like an empty room. And I run a stopwatch while I'm doing that. And in the speaker notes for every slide at the bottom, I put the time that I was at when I finished that slide. And then when I'm giving the talk, I'm literally doing this right now, the bottom of my speaker notes for this slide say 23 minutes, 35 seconds. and I look up at the timer in the Google Slides presentation view. It says 23 minutes, 24 seconds. It still takes a little bit of attention. You do get that kind of moment of having to glance and compare, and like if they're really different, it takes you a second to really parse what that means. But it's the best thing that I've come up with. It certainly helps me a lot. My motivation for doing this, the very first talk I ever gave at the Game Developers Conference I gave when I was 19 years old, and I talked so fast that a talk that took me fully 60 minutes in rehearsal, I finished in less than 40 minutes. And I awkwardly made up something about having left a bunch of time for questions since it was a technical talk, and then nobody had any questions. Super uncomfortable. So I'm very motivated not to ever have that happen to me again. So it's good to have a strategy for this, whatever works for you. All right, so those are just a few things that you can do during preparation to put a lot of this stuff on autopilot. So let's move on to the things that you can do during the performance itself. Making yourself pause. This is, I would say, if only try to communicate one message is my most important preparatory advice, making yourself pause is my most important performance advice. I think one of the worst bad habits that public speakers can have is this deep belief that it's like your job as the speaker to just fill the time with noise, right? Like that's why we say or drag words out or whatever. It's because we're afraid of leaving silence in our talk. And if you have this proclivity, which I think most people do, it can be a huge distraction. It takes a ton of attention to make sure that you're always making some kind of noise. It's like having one extra ball you're constantly juggling. It causes us to speak too fast. It causes us to race to make sure we're not leaving any empty space. I would say the worst thing about it is that it robs you of your primary recovery mechanism. So let's say when you do hit those points where you're totally overwhelmed, your mind is totally blank, you are full deer in headlights in front of a room full of people or a giant grid of faces watching you online. Your primary recovery mechanism here is simply to stop and pause and then use that time to gather your thoughts. The problem is for many of us, when you do stop, that just starts this like panic clock, right? Going, you're like, oh my God, I haven't said anything in 3 seconds. Like, oh, it's 5 seconds now. Oh my God, they're all thinking I'm terrible. So then you get in this bad spiral where the very thing you're trying to do to recover itself only makes you more panicked. And then you kind of realize that that's happening, and that just makes it worse. And on it goes. The irony here, and I think a tool that I've used to convince myself to pause more, is just the knowledge that audiences love pauses. Right? It gives them a moment to digest. It adds more structure to the talk. It's a relief. If you have ever heard anyone talk at exactly the same speed without ever pausing for periods or punctuation or anything like that, it's impossible to remember anything they're saying. Pauses, enunciation, emphasis, all this kind of stuff, that's what makes it easier to remember and to parse your words. And then I think the kind of from an energetic perspective, as the speaker, you are really leading the kind of energy in the room, right? And so if you come across as super nervous and start stammering every time you try to pause, you're going to make everyone else more nervous. If you're able to stop and very confidently pause, it might catch people off guard at first, but then it's actually quite a relief because it conveys such confidence to the room. One trick for this I always do is always have something to drink, because you can't say anything while you're drinking. It's a good way to force yourself. So this is the simplest performance practice. It's just when you're talking, make yourself pause and leave silence in the room on a regular basis throughout your talk. It's more pleasant for the audience, it gives you permission to relax, and it kind of trains you to have this kind of way out when you do get overwhelmed, that you can pause and immediately use that time to recover. My second performance tip is when you need to feel a little more grounded, think about addressing one person at a time. I think this is obviously a little trickier if you can't see the faces of the people you're talking to, like the situation I'm in right now. But even for a lot of online stuff, if you're talking to a Zoom or a Google Meet group, you can see the faces in a grid. The insight here is like staring into a vast audience or a ton of faces can be intimidating, and it's also abnormal. Like, as humans, we don't know how to have a relationship with a group of people. We only know how to have relationships with individuals. I picked this up from, I believe, my last book recommendation, Lee Glickstein's book, Be Heard Now, which is a great book. It's a pretty different approach to public speaking than I grew up with. So I was in high school speech debate, and a lot of it was a focus on kind of memorization and like oratory. And if any of you are familiar with Toastmasters, this is the group that you go to train in public speaking that I think takes more of like almost like a choreography approach to public speaking. You know, friends who've done it talk about how you really like rehearse, and then you're going to take 3 steps, and then you're going to make this gesture for emphasis right when you hit this word, kind of thing. For me, I did that all through high school, but again, it kind of felt a little bit stiff because it wasn't really right. When you have choreography that has nothing to do with the audience, then I think that the audience can tell, right? Like it looks like you're giving this performance, but it doesn't feel like you're connecting with them. So the central thing that Glickstein says in this book is when you're giving a talk, relate to one person at a time. So I usually do this by picking one person at a time. In this case, I know a handful of people that are watching. So even though I can't see them, I am visualizing them in my mind's eye. And I'm simply trying to speak as though I were speaking directly to that one person at a time. And I'll rotate through. Once people actually get together in person again, and you can give a talk to a room of people, one thing to do here if you're a new public speaker, get a bunch of friends to show up for the talk so you have sympathetic faces to look at, but explicitly tell them not to all sit in the front row. Most of the time friends will like come and like pile in the front row for support. You actually want them spread out through the audience so that you have like, it's not obvious you're just looking straight down at the front row the entire time. Whatever strategy you come up with for this, I think the real key things to avoid are don't just stare like down at your notes the whole time, right? Like look at the camera, look at the people. Don't just stare like 1,000-yard, gaze into a sea of faces. And then also, especially when you're doing this in person again, I think everyone's seen someone give a talk where they do the thing where the slides are up and they're like facing away from you and they're looking at the slides and reading the slides. Never, ever do that. All right. Woo, 30 minutes, 26 seconds. I will leave it at that. These specific practices are ones that I find helpful for minimizing a certain set of distractions. But the core thing to remember is good public speaking is good performance. You perform well when you're not trying to consciously juggle a million things. So great performance is about putting as much stuff on autopilot as possible, because then your attention is really left to be present with the audience, right? And presence is what really moves people. People, when I was giving talks at the GDC, the talks that really got reviewed very well are the ones where you could tell the audience members felt like they had a connection with the speaker, that they were really present in the room together, and not just watching something that they could have watched on YouTube and gotten just as much value out of. And when you are dealing with feeling overwhelmed, when you are obsessing about how much time it's taking you, when you are obsessing about keeping your place, that means your attention is with those things and not with your audience. So as you speak more, you'll get a sense for your distractions, which may be different than the ones that I just talked about. But the same strategy applies, which is to find ways either in preparation or during the performance to take that conscious distraction away and kind of make it a habit or put it on autopilot. The more you do this, the more rewarding it becomes to speak, because the more you're free to just enjoy the time you're able to spend together with your audience. And that's all I've got. I'm going to go back and look at the Twitch stream for questions, but thanks everyone for coming, and I hope you found this helpful. All right. Okay. Thanks people for posting in the book recommendations. Gold Moon 1337 cost money to attend each Toastmasters meetup, if I remember correctly. I don't know. I have never done Toastmasters myself, to be honest. I think Glickstein, the guy that I recommended, I haven't actually checked on whether he's still doing this, but he used to run groups called speaking circles, which was very much more like, it's very kind of NorCal hippie, but it's like you get together and one person at a time gets up, and it's less about giving a kind of practiced, rehearsed thing, and more about really trying to be comfortable having everyone looking at you and having their eyes on you. Those I think you definitely need to pay to attend, but his book's great too. Seattle Indies, do you have advice about whether you should rewatch your talks afterwards? I don't have a strong opinion on this. I kind of like rewatch it. Like I gave a GDC talk in 2010 that I honestly rewatch every few years just because I've forgotten a bunch of the content. I think it was pretty good. But I don't know that, I think there's, it's like, are you rewatching them to kind of like see how you were doing? Or are you rewatching them to like check the content or whatever? Yeah, I could see, if you, if you're concerned about kind of just checking in and making sure that you don't have any weird habits that you're unaware of or something like that, then watching your talk could be helpful for that. Yeah. Right. Give other folks time to ask questions. I'm not like a heavy Twitch user, so I hope I've got, okay, yeah, there we go. Yeah, if anyone wants to do anything else, feel free to ask. I've got some time to answer questions. Otherwise, thanks for coming. Hope it was useful. All right, if you do give a talk and feel like it goes badly, do you have advice for how to improve? Yeah, I mean, I think, probably nothing I'm going to say is going to be blinding insight here. I think it's kind of identifying why. I feel like when you're kind of to the content of my talk, when you give a talk and you feel like it went badly, first thing to look at is like, well, why did it go badly, right? Or was I panicked? Was I stammering? Did I kind of have like a little bit of a meltdown? Did I present it well, but people said it just kind of felt a little bit stiff and my delivery was a little unclear? Did I not present it very well? Is the message, I mean, like I've given talks where I'm just like, like kind of just wasn't a compelling talk. I probably want to do it again. But I think in that case, obviously watching the talk afterwards or having friends that watch it that can give you like honest feedback as opposed to just like, that was great, you did so well, can be useful there. We have a couple more minutes here. I'm just going to hang out in case anyone has anything else they want to ask.
Sure. Yeah, if anyone has anything left, pop your questions in the Twitch chat. Otherwise, I think we'll probably end around here. And this talk will also be posted up on our YouTube afterwards. So if you want to go and rewatch Brian's tips before you are going to give a talk in the future, it'll be there so you can watch it again.
Right on. And thanks for taking care of that too. It's nice to have a copy of the talk online. So thanks to Seattle Indies for organizing. That for that, not public speaking per se, but what about when you're put on the spot and have no time to prep? I think this is where my kind of like make yourself pause thing is maybe most relevant. That's kind of the first thing that comes to mind. I think, I mean, nothing communicates confidence like very confidently keeping an audience waiting inside. You're just like, okay, cool. And you just like take 10 seconds, like stop, don't say anything. No one's gonna like interrupt you or cut you off. And if you can do that and it doesn't look like you're shaking in your own boots, I think just kind of like pausing at the beginning and being like, all right, hold on. And then I would say as quickly as you can, just identify the kind of bare bones. It's like, what's the most important, what's the, to my point about message, what's the one thing that you need to communicate? And then think, how to do it without, I would say for a lot of off the cuff responses, we tend to ramble, right? So you tend to say the same thing over and over. We tend to talk to think, right? Where we're saying a bunch of stuff out loud to kind of get to the point. And I think taking a little pause first and just being like, what's the one thing that I need to say? And literally how short can I make it, right? Like how concise can I be and still get the point across? Because that also conveys a lot of confidence. Someone who's put on the spot and can, probably everyone's been in meetings with someone who just came across as super senior and super wise because they just didn't speak very often. When they did, you could tell it was like really thoughtful and concise. All right, Goldman, thanks so much for your recommendations and advice. I do notice some people fill blank spaces with ums and uhs. You write it's distracting. Everyone does it. I still do it. I say like, I say right, I say basically, um, just said So I think to the point about going back and watching your old talks, I think that can be kind of helpful too, just to identify there's not always or like. Basically is one of mine. That's not necessarily a normal one. So knowing which words you tend to use to fill